Once again, to Faith and Freedom Fighters. I'm Robert Muise, co-founder and senior counsel of the American Freedom Law Center. And as usual, I'm joined by my fellow freedom fighter, co-founder and senior counsel, David Yerushalmi. As our loyal listeners know, David and I are first and foremost litigators. And while we certainly believe that these podcasts and videocasts are an important part of our mission at the American Freedom Law Center, our primary mission is to engage in litigation to fight for faith and freedom. We are primarily doers and not just talkers. Now, we do endeavor to do a new podcast each Thursday. However, our litigation schedules do not always cooperate. Consequently, David and I were unable to do a podcast last week. And the reason? We are working on two new and important federal civil rights lawsuits that we just filed. One was filed in federal court in Arizona, and the other was filed in federal court in Michigan. And we will discuss those lawsuits a bit later during this show. But before turning to the lawsuits, we want to spend some time discussing some headlines. If you've been listening to our podcast or watching the video casts, you know that Facebook censored one of our earlier shows where we discussed the evidence showing that COVID-19 was likely leaked, whether intentionally or not, we do not know with any certainty. Motives or intention are often very difficult to prove. But there's credible evidence showing that this virus likely originated in a Wuhan lab. We were allegedly fact-checked by Facebook and its independent fact-checkers and then censored. And for those just listening on the podcast, I was doing air quotes for fact-checked and independent fact-checkers. Well, it looks like Facebook needs some new fact-checkers. Maybe the lawsuit we are preparing against them, and this is a third new lawsuit, not one of the two we'll be discussing later, will cause them to rethink their Orwellian, totalitarian methods of censorship. So, David, welcome, and you've been following the news, and we're learning a little bit more about this Wuhan leak of the China virus. So, welcome.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you to all the listeners who have joined us. And as you pointed out, we were a bit busy last week. We filed the lawsuit that we had been talking about in the federal district court in Arizona, which we'll come to later in the podcast, regarding Twitter's involvement with the Biden administration in censoring speech. You know, the idea of shaping the narrative has always been around in politics and government and public policy. It's even been around in the legal field for trial lawyers, especially criminal trial lawyers who are involved in high-profile cases, because it impacts the jury, potential jury, or the actual jury. It impacts the judge. It impacts the prosecutor, and the prosecutor uses it to impact the defendant's decision as well. So shaping the public debate has always been an important element in any free society, because the fact is that people in a free society have the ability to read all sorts of opinions and all sorts of facts and come up with their own view. And then the majority in a free society tends to then create law, policy, emphasis, etc. So it's an important element. The social media giants and the standard media outlets have always engaged in this process as willing participants. It's especially become a problem, of course, in the last 20 years with the progressive movement's growth in power and influence, which has been a process over the decades. And we've talked about that, so I'm not going to go into it in great detail. But essentially, the mainstream media and the social media giants are entirely in bed with progressives and the leftists. And so they shape all of the discussions about what's taking place. Now, the news that's Fox News is certainly talking about, and now the other outlets, the mainstream and the social media giants, are required to talk about is exactly as you put it, the subject of the source, the origins of the COVID-19, the SARS-CoV or CoV-2 virus. Up until 2 weeks ago, The mandate from the Biden administration to social media was that the social media giants, who were supposed to be bastions of free speech and the exchange of ideas, of course, have now for some time been, and especially since the Trump era, the bastions of the guardian of what progressives will allow you to think about or speak about in more particular terms. And so the Biden administration came out with this policy that the social media giants needed to censor speech that was either negative on the COVID protocols, especially masks, and recently, any discussion of negative discussion of the vaccines. Now, they've included a discussion of the source of the Wuhan lab or the virus coming from the Wuhan lab. The media has been forced to cover this issue because it is so patently obvious that China has engaged in a cover-up. And the Washington Post, which was rare, and it was by the news folks, and it probably slipped by the Jeff Bezos censors at the Washington Post. Remember, the Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post. The Washington Post is the newspaper of record for the Beltway, for Washington, D.C. It was the famous paper that uncovered Watergate and Deep Throat and all of that scenario that you youngsters probably only read about in the history books, but Rob and I actually lived through.
And just for Jeff Bezos is of Amazon fame. He's and if you remember, and those who've been watching the news, and this was an older story, but Amazon owns a lot of servers, and they effectively were one of the ones that shut down Parler and its efforts at free speech by shutting them off of their servers. So Jeff Bezos, who now owns the Washington Post, is the guy who started up Amazon. So
right, and it's even more dangerous than that. Of course, he is one of the richest men in the world, worth tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars. Who knows how much he's worth today? And he is either the richest or one of the top three. His companies, which includes Amazon, which, as Rob pointed out, have these massive servers, these supercomputers that are as good as any government has. They actually contract with the U.S. government, including its intelligence forces, to amass huge amounts of information, data about everything from citizens, from terrorist threats, money laundering. I mean, it's massive. And they get huge contracts from the government to provide their computers and their software capabilities to the government. And in addition, of course, he owns and controls media outlets like the Washington Post. It used to be in the days as President Eisenhower was leaving office, he famously warned against the military industrial complex, the way in which the military industry, the companies that produce military hardware and weaponry, would oftentimes absorb retiring generals from the highest ranks of the military in order to use them to go back and lobby Congress and the executive branch for war and war-making materials, et cetera. And that used to be a famous narrative of the left, that the military-industrial complex was in control of the country. And they made lots of very, very good movies about spies and military folks who were betrayed by the military-industrial complex that really didn't care about America, but cared about simply enriching themselves. Well, it's interesting that progressives and leftists do not do that analysis when it comes to the Bezos and the social media giants, or the Faucis, the Dr. Faucis of the world, who have this symbiotic relationship with these entities. So let's now talk about the Fauci emails, which have become the newest rage in the media, and in large part driven by Fox News and conservative outlets that have forced the social media giants on the left to pay attention to it. We now know that the evidence from the beginning until today that the virus, COVID virus, could not have come from the Wuhan lab was false. Even the statement that suggests that it's highly improbable that it came from the Wuhan lab, we know today is false. That statement is false. It can't be made. Now, one can still argue that they think that the COVID virus evolved naturally, and we're going to talk about a little bit of that. I don't want to get too much in the weeds because it can become biologically confusing. But what we know today is that the evidence probably that we have today, but we don't know a lot, stacks up in favor of some kind of biological evolution. Now, might that have been helped along in the lab? Certainly, and we have no evidence that it wasn't. But there is evidence that, in
That's
fact,
the whole point of the gain of function is to
Right.
is those lab the research that was done there, which is apparently
right. And
illegal to
I
do
want
in
to
the
talk
United
about
States.
I want to talk about gain of function in particular, so our listeners can really appreciate what's going on out there. So you had Dr. Fauci in the early days, and we know all the flip-flops, masks are not going to help you, and all of a sudden masks become the most important thing, to the point where you should wear 2 masks even if you've been vaccinated or you've already had the infection. So we know all about those flip-flops. And that's because what we've talked about here on many occasions is that Dr. Fauci does not practice science. He hasn't for years and maybe even decades ever done the actual measurement of science. That's all science can do. All science can do, properly speaking, is measure. It can look at something and measure it. Public policy, utilizing scientific consensus, the idea that even though science can't know something, they can come to a consensus, a kind of informal agreement about what the measurements might mean. And then public policy officials then impose upon people like us various restrictions and protocols based upon what they believe to be the balancing of the risks and the benefits. Now, Dr. Fauci made statements early on that it could not have come from the Wuhan lab, that all the evidence is that it evolved naturally. Now, gain of function typically addresses 2 aspects of a virus in the same way that the natural biology does. The 2 main aspects of a virus are how deadly or how sick you get from it, how bad is the virus, and how infectious it is. Those are the 2 main elements. And that's what the studies that Dr. Fauci was mailing around, emailing, and this is what we discovered in the emails, to various colleagues and media official and politicians and just people. It was shown that he was emailing essentially 3 studies and some others, and they're not really properly studies. They're analyses. They themselves, none of this so-called scientific work actually did the measurements. They were relying on other people who had done measurements. And essentially what they were saying is that, look, there's 3 ways this deadly virus is what it is. 1, it came from animals and evolved in animals so that it could then jump to humans. And the reason why that aspect, and that's the infectious aspect, COVID typically, and they're called beta coronaviruses, are the ones that affect mammals, and we're mammals, and bats, and pangolins, and other animals like camels for the COVID, the coronavirus that affected the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. in years ago. But these viruses don't have the proper biological properties to be affect the cells of humans. They can't latch on. They can't affect the cells. The spikes of the coronavirus, when modified either naturally or through gain of function, are able to then jump from animal to human. Now, there's no evidence yet that there's been gain of function on that jumping, but we do see this gap. And that's what the studies that Dr. Fauci sent around to prove that it could not have been man-made. We see a gap between the virus that exists in bats, which is likely the source, but probably not. And I say likely, but probably not because the scientists don't know. And that's a contradiction in terms. And it could have come from some other mammal. But again, there's no clear biology that shows us how it jumped while still in animals. So the other possibility is that there were what were called cryptic infections of humans. That is to say, a virus from an animal like a bat in the Wuhan wet market somehow jumped to a human because that one virus had a mutation of sorts and got to the human, and then that human virus was able to mutate while in the human infect someone else. And so that the gain of function for the ability to infect humans in large scale occurred while it was in a human. The third possibility is that this evolution took place in the Wuhan Lab. And it could have taken place there several ways. One way is that while they were studying the coronavirus in the Wuhan Lab, and we know they were, we just don't know if it was the ancestor of this virus, that while in the lab and doing their various experiments, and it may or may not have been gain of function, it mutated and evolved, and Wuhan Lab individuals became sick and then infected the rest of China. And we know from the Washington Post story owned by Jeff Bezos, and this was the kicker that forced the media to cover this story, that 3 workers of the Wuhan lab became ill with COVID-like symptoms in December of 2019. Now, the media had to now cover this origin story because the Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos, and he couldn't censor his own newspaper. So the media had to pay attention, and it was precisely because the Washington Post let this story go out. And my guess is the editor of the news section simply didn't follow the rules of the game. And my guess is also the editor who allowed that story to get published is in hot water. Now, I don't know that, but I'm willing to bet you that that's the case. Now,
so the story leaked out like the virus leaked out of the Wuhan
yeah,
lab.
because every now and then it's very hard to keep conspiracies a secret. Ultimately, we know that they can be kept secret for a long time, right? We know that when the government did its syphilis studies in the South and allowed Black men who had syphilis to just suffer as part of their experiment to see what happens when you don't treat versus when you do treat, that experimentation took place over a period of time and then was kept secret for a long period of time. So we do know it can happen. But now moving a little bit more to the details, gain of function will either make a virus more deadly, or it can simply take a deadly virus and make it more infectious. We don't know precisely if there was gain of function research being done at Wuhan Lab on coronavirus, and we don't know what type it might have been if it was taking place. But we don't know that it wasn't, and we know that the Wuhan Lab is the most sophisticated lab in China for gain of function type of research. And we know that Fauci's funding arms of the government in fact, gave money to a US-based group of researchers who then gave money to the Wuhan Lab and worked closely with the Chinese woman in charge over there called Bat Lady, because she did so much work on bats and coronavirus and research, because bats are a main carrier of many different variations of coronavirus. And all we know is what China, the Chinese Communist Party, has told us, which is we didn't use that money for gain of function. Well, we don't know that. And precisely because the Chinese government and the people who work for the Chinese government, which means all of these scientists, they are employed, and their livelihood and their reputations and their very lives and the lives of their families are dependent upon the Chinese Communist Party, one of the most tyrannical, one of the most fascist governments in the world. So whatever the left and the progressives think about Trump and the Trump government or the US government or the military industrial complex or anything else, you would have to multiply that by a factor of almost infinity to understand how evil and how tyrannical the Communist Chinese Party is. So every time you read about from the media that fact checks any talk about this conspiracy, the Wuhan Lab, et cetera, just know that the denials come from that tyrannical government. So the bottom line is this: Fauci did not have any serious evidence that this virus did not evolve in the lab naturally, meaning they were working on the coronavirus any more than it might have evolved in nature. At no time, and they still don't know. The studies that I reviewed in the last several days make it clear that we don't know whether the coronavirus became infectious for human beings while still in the mammal kingdom. We don't know if it jumped to a human and then evolved there. And we don't know if it evolved in the Wuhan lab. Now, the piece of evidence that everyone is so upset about is that in these emails, aside from several different threads, is that Fauci was told by a researcher that if you look carefully at the biology of the coronavirus that allows it to be infectious, massively infectious in human beings, if you look carefully at aspects of the gene and the way they mapped it, it looks like it could have been engineered. Now, keep in mind that when you engineer a virus to be infectious or deadly, and especially if you're doing that for purposes of military research, you don't do it so it's obvious. You know, as a scientist in China or anywhere else, what the other scientists know. They know what an engineered virus will look like. It will have aspects to its biology that don't show a natural evolution. And viruses tend to mutate and then evolve in small little stages, not leaps. It can happen, but that's not typically the way it happens. So if you're a scientist working on a military weapon, you want to disguise the fact that it's been engineered. So it wouldn't surprise me that a researcher early on would say, you know, if you look carefully, you can see that it might be engineered. Now, Fauci, after getting that email, sent around a bunch of scary emails with important in all caps and sent around, we need to talk about this. And soon thereafter, the same scientist who mentioned about the engineering element and others began to produce these research papers, which weren't really research. They were simply analyzing other people's research, making the argument that, poo-pooing the Wuhan lab, it looks like it came from nature. But if you look at those research papers, they're simply speculation. They dismiss the Wuhan lab because they're simply confirming their own bias that it could not have been by a scientist, even though we know that lab leaks, and it's mentioned in some of these papers that Fauci was sending around, occur from labs, that humans get sloppy, that when you've been working on a virus, even a deadly virus, for months, years, one after the other, you tend to allow protocols to slip. It happens in every field of endeavor. We know it happens, and it can cause tragedy. What was the spacecraft that exploded, and we know that it was
The Challenger.
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 No, as a result of the fact that we got sloppy with the O-ring maintenance. And as a result, our astronauts were tragically killed in front of the world's eyes as it took off. It happens all the time. Rob and I see it in the practice of law. I'm general counsel to a couple of companies, and I can tell you, no matter how many times we tell people, these are the protocols you must observe, over time, those protocols will be violated because that's human nature. Now, Fauci was telling Congress and the public over and over again that, in fact, it could not have come from the lab. There was no gain of function research. And what we know today is that was false. We don't know the opposite is certainly true, but we know that his statements were absolutely false. Now, I will tell you that in my reading of his public testimonies and under oath, but his public pronouncements, there's always a bit of wiggle room in his statements. And what the media is now doing are taking those emails, which are make Fauci look potentially like a liar who is engaged in a narrative to cover up a major issue that the U.S. may very well have been involved in paying for the research that caused this virus to spread around the world. And at the very least, it was the work of Chinese scientists, intentionally, recklessly, or negligently, that caused the spread. And why would the U.S. government not want that to become public? Because Biden and his son, Hunter Biden, have been close to the Communist Party and the bigwigs in China for years. And he does not want to upset the balance of power when it comes to China, when it comes to trade, when it comes to the currency, everything. And his motivation is to protect that relationship. So there are a lot of tentacles here. We don't have all the answers. I will tell you, there is no smoking gun, no matter what Fox News says, but there is a lot of smoke. And right now, and as litigators, we can tell you when there's a lot of smoke, Occam's razor, the simple explanation is that there's a gun there, there's a fire, there's something going on. And Fauci and the Biden administration and media and the big social media giants are trying to simply blow that smoke away by adding more smoke to it and claiming that it's all innocent smoke. Someone's just barbecuing chicken in the backyard and there's nothing to see here. Don't get fooled by that.
Yeah, and you add to all this is what we've discussed previously. This World Health Organization so-called investigation. China did all it could to to hide evidence, to present, to prohibit an investigation into the real evidence that would reveal the answer to this. So you had China involved in a cover-up, World Health Organization going along with that cover-up. And like I said, when you look at all the evidence, and we mentioned the difference between direct evidence and circumstantial evidence, the smoke that you're referring to, in my view, the circumstantial evidence is it's more likely than not that this was from a Wuhan leak. They were doing gain of function research, right? We don't know if it's specifically doing it on this virus. By why wouldn't they? All right, this is one of the main viruses that they were studying there in the Wuhan lab. And you had these workers that got sick in December of symptoms similar to the COVID-19 symptoms. You had them shutting down the domestic flights, opening up the international flights. You have all this evidence, and it just keeps mounting. And we also had mentioned the Republicans in the House think it was the Intelligence Committee, calling for a further investigation into all of this, because of the circumstantial evidence to me just keeps mounting in favor of the position that this virus came from the Wuhan Lab. So, I want to move on to another story that you sent me so we can get to these cases. You sent me a story yesterday from NPR, the National Public Radio, right? No surprise there when I tell you what the title of this story is. And National Public Radio is taxpayer funded. It's amazing how the left can get their media funded by taxpayers. And this article was titled, quote, "A Guide to Gender Identity Terms," end quote. And David, as you put it in your message to me, this is hilarious if it weren't so utterly tragic. We keep hearing how the left is all about science and the right is a bunch of Neanderthals who reject science. Well, the last time I checked, biology is a science. And this guide is just so absurd. And I'm going to give you some samples of some of the absurdity from this article. It talks about the proper use of gender identity terms, including pronouns. They say it's a crucial way to signal courtesy and acceptance, right? Isn't that what it's all about? It's all about acceptance of these absurd positions that they take. And here's some of their questions and answers regarding pronouns. So they have a definition section. The first one is sex. And they said it refers to a person's biological status as is typically assigned at birth, usually on the basis of external anatomy. It's assigned at birth? But here's their definition of gender. Gender is often defined as a social construct of norms, behaviors, and roles that varies between societies and over time. Didn't realize that. I didn't realize that this was just a social construct. And so gender identity is one's own internal sense of self in their gender, whether that is man, woman, neither, or both. Neither or both? Seriously? How does that happen biologically? And here's some of they say non-binary. Here's another term. I wasn't even familiar with these. Is a term that can be used by people who do not describe themselves or their genders as fitting into the categories of man or woman. What is the other category? This is just agender. Here's another one. Agender is an adjective that can describe a person who does not identify as any gender. Okay. It gets even better. So they go on to say, using the correct pronouns for trans and non-binary youth is a way to let them know that you see them, you affirm them, and you accept them. And there's a quote here from a person who was interviewed. It's really about letting someone know that you accept their identity. Look, a person was born. They're either born a man or they're born a woman. I can accept them as how God created them, right? We know from Genesis, God created man and woman, and it is good. I didn't see another second, third, fourth, or fifth category of, that God created. And let me go on here. So what's the right way to find out a person's pronoun? So this is something, I guess, that's kind of socially important. You start by giving your own. For example, my pronouns are she/her. And you go on to quote this. If I was introducing myself to someone, I would say, I'm Rodrigo. I use him pronouns. What about you? So apparently that's the way to break the ice to learn somebody's pronoun. Here's another one. This one was just absolutely amazing to me. I never heard this until I read it. How is they used as a singular pronoun? So this is quoting the article. They is already commonly used as a singular pronoun when we are talking about someone and we don't know who they are. O'Hara notes, somebody that was interviewed, using they, them pronouns for someone you do know simply represents just a little bit of a switch, according to this article. And here's a further quote. I identify as non-binary myself and I appear feminine. People often assume that my pronouns are she/her, so they will use those. And I'll just gently correct them and say, hey, you know what? My pronouns are they, them. Just FYI, for future reference or something like that. End quote, they say. So you can be a plural pronoun as one person as well. If this isn't as confusing and absurd, then I don't know what planet you live on. You can't make this stuff up. I didn't know you referred to a person as they, a singular person as they or them, and this non-binary and agender. Like I said, God created man and woman. That's it. And it was good. You're either one or you're the other. You can't be both. You can't be some sort of third creature because there was no third human creature created. And this stuff is just, again, David, you said to me it would be hilarious if it wasn't so utterly tragic. Because all the wokes out there, you work in a private business, private company, they're all going to, have these seminars about what pronoun you're supposed to be using for individuals. They recommend that, when you send somebody an email, you should say in the email what pronoun that you use. So that way they can, when they greet you, they can do it appropriately and you don't have to gently, correct them according to this article. Amazing. You just can't make this stuff up.
You really can't. And you know what? And again, just to kind of dip our toe in the water a bit, we do know, of course, in the Jewish Bible, the Torah talks about it, Jewish law addresses it. There are individuals who are born with mixed sexual biological parts, but they're anomalies. And granted, their lives can be confusing, if not tortuous, to deal with those issues, but they are anomalies. What these people are talking about are—
Right. And just to be clear, that's not what they're referring to here at all. And I understand that there are those types of biological anomalies, which are very, very rare, but that's not this at all.
Right. They're talking about biological men or biological women claiming to be something else. Now, just an aside as a story, I famously represented Earth Cafe in litigation by some Muslim girls, young women who claimed that they were kicked out of the cafe because they wore hijabs, which was false. And their attorney was Mohammed Taj Azhar, a young Muslim man. And he worked for a hardcore progressive leftist lawyer in Pasadena when he sued. Well, eventually he moved over to the American Civil Liberties Union, the progressive leftist version of a civil rights organization. And when he moved, I started getting emails from him on his signature block in the superscript, the little like numbers you would put on top of an exponent on top of a number that would read I/he/we/they, that these were the pronouns that applied to him. So I was in a deposition and I asked him, I'm just curious, I don't understand why. And at the time I really didn't. I wasn't up on all this gender identity stuff. And I asked him, you're Muhammad. You're clearly a man. What's the confusion here? And he said, I just want people to understand what I identify with. And then I looked at the they and trying to figure out who's the they. Do you have multiple personalities? You have some kind of disorder psychologically that you need to tell me that one day I might be speaking to Mohammed Tajar and tomorrow I might be speaking to Sarah, Paley. In any event, it becomes so absurd that it's funny. But keep in mind, as we laugh about this is very much a part of the progressives' mandate and agenda to literally have us see reality in ways that aren't real. And if they can do that about gender, then they can do it about everything, because there's nothing more manifest, nothing more palpable, nothing more concrete than your gender. So if we can be told that people can wake up one day, they're woke, and realize that they're pan people, that they're more than one gender, that they're not just men or women, they can be multiples. If we can come to believe that and accept that in society, we're pretty sick. Let me just point out that, the idea that there are races, or the idea that there are genders is, we're now being told, is a social construct. But the fact is if it's a social construct, the left has told us about social constructs that they don't like racism, that it's not real, that it doesn't really exist. A social construct is what we in society informally, unconsciously agree will be the framework for our thinking and our speaking. Well, if all of this gender identity is nothing more or less than a social construct, then they're getting us to believe something that's false. And the underlying notion is, as Rob pointed out earlier, that I have some kind of obligation, as NPR writes, I have some kind of societal obligation to accept the fact that Mohammed Tajar identifies as a certain pronoun or group of pronouns. I don't have an obligation to accept that. And the fact that I don't accept it might hurt his feelings is not on me. It's on him, because he's rejecting or accepting biology at a whim. I accept the reality of the world on its own terms and deal with that. We don't have an obligation not to hurt people's feelings when they've taken a view that contradicts reality. As good people, we shouldn't want to go around hurting people's feelings, and we shouldn't want to do it willy-nilly. But if I'm engaging in reality, then I have zero obligation to worry about your feelings, because you might not accept reality.
Yeah, and you know what? I think it's far more sinister. This is a corruption, an absolute corruption of God's creation, right? And I find it offensive as a person of faith that they would do that. And I don't want to play their games of corrupting what God created and what God himself said was good, the creation of man and the creation of woman. And that to me is at the bottom line is where this is utterly offensive, and should be utterly offensive to anybody who any person of faith. In fact, it should be utterly offensive to all of us, because we're all part of God's creation.
And let me take that a step further, Rob, because that's an important point. And even if we have to push off discussions to another week about the cases, but here's the point that Rob just made. Now Rob's a faithful Catholic, so he's going to be insulted or upset about the corruption of God's creation. And I, as an Orthodox Jew, would be upset. But what is the real sinister aspect? Why is that sinister? It's sinister because if you can corrupt what God created in a person's mind, you're not actually corrupting it, right? A man is still a man, a woman is still a man. God's truth is still God's truth. The reality is still the reality. God created the reality. But if you can corrupt it in our minds, what have you done? You've eliminated transcendence. You've eliminated godliness. You've eliminated any base understanding of why we're in this world, what's good, what's bad. If you can eliminate a transcendent understanding of truth and falsehood, good and evil, then who's left to define and decide what is good and evil? Man. And it becomes whatever either the strongest man wants, the most powerful. And right now we're talking about, the militaristic countries like China or Russia. I put Russia on the side, but certainly China. Or we're talking about social media giants as power sources in human existence. Or the fact is that majorities can decide. So either you have the most powerful individual or individual government, small group, or you have mob rule, democracy writ small. That is to say, majoritarian rule, no understanding that there are certain inalienable rights that we have from God that no government can tear asunder. And that was the purpose of our country's founding, to establish a democracy, but not as a mob rule, not as a little d, but as a constitutional republic that said the majorities are allowed to rule in the main, but there are important breaks on that power. Because if you allow majoritarian rule simple democracy, then you have mob rule. And when you have mob rule, you have tyranny, plain and simple.
Now, and that, this is this issue of tyranny. When you see totalitarian regimes, a common theme in all of those is the suppression of religious freedom, right? And this kind of segues. We're going to talk about my case I filed in Michigan second. It might be worthwhile to pull that one up, and maybe we save your discussion of the Arizona case till our next podcast. But it's I'm representing this group, Catholic Healthcare International, who acquired 40 acres of property in Genoa Township here in Michigan. It was deeded to them by the diocese. The diocese owned the property. They were intending to build a church on the property, but because of things that happened over economically and so forth, a number of people that moved out of that particular area. It's a very rural area. They decided it wouldn't make sense to build a large church there. It probably wouldn't be supported by the local population. So they deeded the property over to Catholic Healthcare International, which is a recognized organization, a Catholic organization of the lay faithful. And they wanted to build an adoration chapel, a small chapel, 95 seats. It was 6,000 square feet, only 39 parking spots, named after Saint Padre Pio. It was going to be an adoration chapel. 40 acres of the property, only 5 acres were going to be developed in this rural area. It met all the requirements. This zoning, just like most other places when they zone for churches, you have to get a special approval for land use. The churches are typically allowed in residential zoned property. This was residentially zoned, very, very rural. And they also had on the property, they have the Stations of the Cross, 14 stations, which are basically images, icons, 14 icons that you would pray at each one of these that represent a different station, a different aspect of the passion of Christ, his last days on the earth as a man before his crucifixion, and so these are small signs, and they also had a display of an image of Our Lady that was part of this temporary mural wall. And the township denied their zoning, and in fact ordered them to remove the Stations of the Cross and the mural wall. There's federal law that prohibits this. It's called the Religious Land Use Institutionalized Persons Act, which was designed to prohibit this type of religious discrimination in zoning, because most times places of religious worship have to get a special land use, which oftentimes have these subjective amorphous standards, like is it harmonious with the property and so forth. This plainly met all of those standards, as a matter of fact, met all the objective standards, but yet it was still denied by the township, and so we sued. And the point here is, and they're standing up to this township because these attacks on religious liberty, and this is an attack on religious liberty. The way. And what came to mind when this all transpired, and I was first told that, look, they're going to be told to remove these Stations of the Cross. They're small, like on a pole, a small plaque on the top that has a religious icon that you stand before you pray and you move on to the next station, or this image of Our Lady is going to be removed off this private property. I remember these grainy black and white images when Nazi Germany invaded Poland. Right. And one of the first things that they did is they went around and they removed all the religious icons. There were all the public displays of religion, taking the crosses down, taking any other religious symbol you can. Why? Because that's how you subjugate a people. Right? Totalitarians know that. You remove their religion. The other thing they do is they take away your guns as well. Most of these totalitarian regimes, you can't have any firearm to defend yourself. But religious freedom is always one of the first things that goes with totalitarian regimes, and you got to fight back and you got to push back. This little chapel on 40 acres of land in a rural area, there was not even a requirement for a traffic study because it was such a minimal impact. They're only going to develop 5 acres of the 40 acres. Yet in this same zoning area, and only a couple miles away from the proposed chapel site, the town has their own park, has a public park, right? My client, they called it a prayer campus, is what they were trying to develop, with a small chapel and these prayer trails which you could go and meditate, pray the Stations of the Cross, and and just be out in nature and pray. So they couldn't have their religious park, but just 3 miles away, the township has this huge park on 38 acres, less acreage than my clients are on, with swing sets and water parks and 200 plus parking spaces. It's phenomenal, the way that they discriminate against religion. So we just filed, actually it was yesterday, we filed this federal lawsuit under that RILUPA statute, a federal statute, and as well as the First and 14th Amendments. Because even after their development was denied, they got a letter just at the in the early May telling them they also had to remove the Stations of the Cross and the mural wall because they somehow violate their sign ordinance. We've got pictures. There's bird houses and all kinds of things all around the township that don't require permits and fees and prior approval, that are erected and put up all over the place. They have all sorts of exemptions for signs, for historical markers and temporary signs, real estate signs, and everything else. But these religious symbols, well, they got to go, or you got to pay a fee or get private approval or prior approval for them. That's called a prior restraint on speech. These attacks on religious freedom are just, they got to stop, and that's why we file these lawsuits. And as I say all the time, we're advocates, right? We fight these fights on behalf of people, but it always takes the client. Like in the case you have in Arizona, David, on behalf of that doctor, it takes the client to stand up and say, you know what, enough's enough. I'm going to stand up, put my name on a pleading, and we're going to sue these violators of our fundamental rights, and they're willing to do that, and we're the advocates for them. So it's kind of this attack on religious freedom, and it's happening so many different ways. It's happening through the social media censoring speech. It's happening through this transgendered corruption of God's creation. It's just this slow suppression of people of faith. And I see it all the time. People at work, they have to leave their workplace, or they feel so much pressure because of all this diversity training and forcing upon them values, the left's values, which are totally contrary to religious principles. And it makes it almost impossible for them to work in these places. But this attack on religious freedom is real, and this case we filed yesterday makes the point very clearly. And it's Catholic Healthcare International versus Genoa Township.
Yeah, and it again requires underscoring that our law firm, American Freedom Law Center, represents these clients pro bono, because these are more important than the individuals that we represent, quite frankly, the issues. And they understand that, our clients in the main. And we explain that to them, that we get requests all the time to represent individuals in a kind of individual dispute, sometimes touching upon freedom of speech, sometimes freedom of religion. But the cases that we take on are the ones that touch upon, articulate, and give voice to the destruction of Western civilization, which is the foundation of this country. And the idea that a religious body owning acres and acres of land cannot provide the facilities for their worshipers to utilize that property in a reasonable way is not unusual. This occurs throughout this country. And typically, the villages and the cities that are claiming to enforce their zoning regulations are doing it against Jewish and Christian organizations. What's interesting, but not surprising, is that the same villages and the same cities, when confronted with Islamic development, and even development which clearly changes the nature of the neighborhood, imposes traffic obligations on the neighborhood that go well beyond what was allowed under the current zoning laws. When it comes to those organizations, villages and cities rubber stamp them all the time. And we've been involved in several litigations, and one in particular where this was in fact the case. And Why is that? Well, the same question can be asked is, why did the progressives during this whole coronavirus thing seem to accept the word of Communist Party officials and scientists who were paid by Communist Party? Why is it that progressives and leftists embrace the Soviet Union as um, the the good force in the world, while American and Western civilization was the evil force in the 1950s and 1960s? Well, the explanation based upon what we said here today and what anyone who understands history and political philosophy knows to be the case. The force of progressivism, the main agenda of progressivism is to destroy the notion that, which is fundamental to this country, that men writ large have liberty and integrity from God, and that can never be torn asunder. The soul of man exists, and that soul articulates certain liberty, certain integrity that you simply can't murder, you can't do away with. Totalitarianism, the idea that someone wants to control mankind, whether it's a village, a city, a state, a country, or the world, as in the Chinese government. In order to do that, you have to destroy that notion in their minds. Men and women have to come to the view that there is no such thing as the human soul. There is no such thing as inalienable rights, as the founders called it, what was soulful integrity of each individual, that each individual has a worth that's equal to the worth of the world. That's fundamental to Western civilization. You can't sacrifice my life, my soul for the greater good. You can't do that. I might choose to do that individually, but you can't get together and decide that my life isn't worth the good that might come to a greater number of people. Tyranny requires that notion that my life is not worth the greater good, or it's not worth the good of the tyrannical power that wants to do something. That is the fundamental aspect of liberalism and progressivism, liberalism that we know today. Now, I will tell you that 99% of progressives and liberals have no idea that that's fundamental to their beliefs. They couldn't articulate that even in their quiet moments. And they'll deny it if you may have that discussion with them, because they simply don't know. They've simply have drunk the Kool-Aid, as they say. They've grown up, they've suckled at this source, so that it's just part of their thinking. But I also will guarantee you that the leadership, the intellectual and the power leadership of that movement certainly does understand. And that's why you find cities and villages in America attacking Christians in the way that Rob just described, or Jews, but ignoring the Islamic side of things, or the Communist Party side of things, or the Soviet Union side of things, precisely because those other things represent the destruction of Western civilization. And Western civilization, having been founded on Jewish and subsequently Christian concepts, the Judeo-Christian foundation of this country, is what they're seeking to destroy, plain and simple. And if you look at our website, AmericanFreedomLawCenter.org or AFLC.us, and you go to our mission statement, you see that we put that front and center. We're fighting for the Judeo-Christian foundation of this society. And of course, when the left wants to attack us as bigots and racists, that's the first thing they quote. And they don't even say anything about it. Just wanting to defend the Judeo-Christian foundation of Western civilization is enough to a leftist to say, that organization and those individuals are haters. They're trying to, enslave us to their own philosophy, when in fact the truth is its opposite.
Well, they're very good. I'll add one thing. I'm not going to give so many of them 99%, whatever number you gave, as a pass. I think the leadership of this movement is demonic. I think there really is a spiritual battle out there, and there are evil forces out there, and I think that's what's driving, whether it's in the leadership that's pushing this movement, which is so anti-God in so many ways. But you summed it up very nicely there, and I think that that'll wrap us up for today. We're going to have to save your discussion of the Arizona lawsuit till next time, which will be, I think, a very good discussion. That's the lawsuit against Twitter and the Biden administration. But I think David at the end there just summed up, this battle that we're in. Like I said, it really is. It's a spiritual battle at the end of the day, and it's a battle for our soul, battle for the soul of America. And it's, there's Satan's real, evil's real, right? And somebody once said his greatest triumph in the 20th century was to convince people he doesn't exist. And I think this is a demonic movement, and we need to recognize it for what it is. And we got to pray for the salvation of our nation, and we just have to. So again, that's all the time we have today. Thank you all for tuning in, listening, or watching, however you're getting our podcast. We look forward to our next discussions. As you know, our video casts are posted on Rumble and our Rumble and YouTube channels, and our podcasts are posted on Spotify and Stitcher. And if you like the content, please follow us and please spread the word. Thank you again. And as always, as we finish up, we say, may God bless you and may he continue to bless America.
Amen.